Advait Praturi is the director of Ergon Labs LLC, a content strategy agency which specializes in learning experience and curriculum design in the Indian context. He holds a BA Economics Hons and BA Political Science Hons from the University of California, San Diego, and an MDiv from Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena. He's passionate about Tolkien's works and seeks to see a deepened appreciation of fairy stories in India and the global south. He currently lives in Mumbai with his wife, Erica, his cats, Star and Hobbs, and his socially awkward puppy, Luna. Okay, there we go. So I hope you enjoy our first pre-recorded paper.
Hi, everyone. The name of this talk is Darkness Alone is Worshipful, a Númenórean Theological Anthropology of Worship. Now, it might surprise many that the stories of Middle-earth seem to lack religious rituals or forms, especially given Tolkien's devout Catholic theology and practice. Indeed, according to Wayne Hammond and Christina Squall, quote, he was always rigorous about attending confession before Mass and a firm believer in habitual prayer. And yet, Tolkien writes, quote, there are no temples or churches in this world among good peoples. They had little or no religion in the sense of worship, end quote, at least in the ritualistic sense. And yet, despite this, it is evident that worship is significant to the central conflict of Tolkien's legendarium. In Tolkien's words, in The Lord of the Rings, the conflict is basically about God and his sole right to divine honor. The Eldar and the Númenóreans believed in the one, the true God, and held worship of any other person an abomination. Furthermore, the idea of worship is central to the conflict at the heart of the Akallabeth. As he plays upon the fears and yearnings of men for the blessed realm, Sauron, quote, bade men think that darkness alone is worshipful. This cunning deception would set in motion a chain of events that would directly lead to the downfall of Númenor. Given the central importance of worship in Tolkien's work, this paper seeks to offer a Númenórean theological anthropology of worship and place Tolkien's work in conversation with scholars such as the Christian philosopher James Smith, as well as the bhakti philosophy of Hindu philosopher Ramanuja. This paper will aim to use the frameworks and tools of comparative theology to explore the dynamics of worship in Númenor. To borrow from the words of the Jesuit priest Francis Cluny, given that theological discourse in a pluralistic society is necessarily, quote, interreligious, comparative, dialogical, and confessional, end quote, holding Hindu and Christian articulations of worship and dialogue can offer a more robust understanding of worship while still respecting the specific convictions of both. Now, two qualifications for those who are unfamiliar with the term theological anthropology. In short, this is the study of how humans relate to the supernatural and how humans form rituals, customs, and experiences in relationship to the divine. Unlike cultural anthropology, it also assumes that a supernatural and divine being has agency in this relationship. Second, a limitation of this paper. While we are exploring broad themes in Christianity and Hinduism, we will not explore the many various traditions and interpretations and variations in schools of thought, even within schools of bhakti, but these are important to acknowledge. That being said, by bridging the Númenórean expression of worship in conversation with both Hindu and Christian theologies, one might discover a deeper understanding of how worship shaped the Númenóreans in a way that goes beyond mere ritual. In short, this paper aims to demonstrate that worship did not simply consist of ritualistic behavior, but rather the embodied orientation of one's being toward an object of ultimate value, whether that be Eru at the time of Númenor's might, or ultimately darkness at the time of Númenor's downfall. We begin with a brief overview of worship before, during, and after the fall of Númenor. See, the Númenóreans were essentially pure monotheists who indwelled in a, quote, monotheistic world of natural theology, end quote. At the height of the Second Age, kings would ascend the pillar of heaven, the Meneltarma, the great mountain of Númenor, a space that was, quote, sacred to the worship of Eru Ilúvatar, to perform three prayers, the Eru Kiarme, Eru Laitale, and Eru Hantale. At the time of the fall, however, Sauron began corrupting the minds of the Númenóreans. Sauron would challenge the Númenórean conception, calling Eru a, quote, fictitious sanction to which the Valar appealed if anyone questioned their rulings, end quote. Tolkien describes the subsequent ritual worship of Melkor as a, quote, Satanist religion with a large temple. Sauron would desacralize the summit of Meneltarma with a building dedicated in worship to a corrupted being, Melkor. Of course, Sauron's ultimate motivation in deceiving Ar-Pharazôn and the Númenóreans was that he himself would eventually be worshipped as the ultimate object of value. As Tolkien notes, quote, Sauron desired to be a god king, demanding divine honor from all rational creatures. Finally, as Sam McBride notes, the Númenóreans in exile in the late Third Age, quote, devised no formal worship and recognized no holy places during the era of the War of the Ring. Instead, the primary act of religion involves rejecting worship directed toward any creature, end quote, and is characterized by reverence and gratitude. An example of this is the Gondorian grace at meat. Before they ate, Faramir and all his men turned and faced west in a moment of silence. He said as they sat down, we look towards Númenor that was, and beyond Elvenhome that is, and to that which is beyond Elvenhome and will ever be. The act is notable in that it demonstrates embodiment, turning and facing west, meditation and contemplative knowledge in a moment of silence, and a sense of orientation to an ultimate love that now seems long lost. Though not specifically identified as an act of worship, the following sections will demonstrate how grace at meat was indeed worshipful. We begin with the Christian anthropology of worship. In Desiring the Kingdom, James K. A. Smith builds off an Augustinian definition of human persons as essentially, quote, embodied agents of desire or love who inhabit the world not primarily as thinkers or believers, but as affective embodied creatures, shaped not so much by an intellectually constructed worldview, but a desired object of ultimate value. In other words, we don't so much think our way through the world as we feel our way through the world. In Smith's words, quote, the telos to which our love is aimed is not a list of ideas or propositions, but rather, quote, a vision of the good life that has been painted for us in stories and myths, images, and icons. Moreover, worship in this sense is ultimately not cerebral, but is profoundly visceral and shaped by embodied practices, routines, and rituals that orient the human heart toward this object of ultimate value. These bodily practices are critical in training the heart to desire certain ends and ultimately shape our precognitive disposition to the world by training our desires. In other words, embodied practices are essential in forming people and orienting them towards the ultimate love. At the same time, worship cannot be reduced to mere ritual only. The same basic intuition is echoed by other Christian thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas, whose natural theology, according to Paul Coker, provides some context to understanding Tolkien's own theological instincts. For Aquinas, intentionality refers to the act of directing one's will toward a specific object or end. Quote, when we pray or worship, we direct our intention to God. End quote. In other words, for Aquinas, worship with intention is a conscious and deliberate act of devotion toward an object of ultimate value. In short, worship, broadly defined, is an embodied orientation aimed towards this object of ultimate value. What we love in worship is both consciously and unconsciously shaped by liturgies, stories, festivals, etc. That passion we feel for that love causes us to develop a set of outward practices that orient us to seek or even attempt to possess this object of love, which eventually shapes the character of the worshiper. We can now see how this particular view compares and contrasts with the Hindu bhakti anthropology of worship. At its most basic understanding, bhakti is often simply understood as devotional worship or devotional love. However, David Haberman offers a more compelling definition. Bhakti is better seen as the pursuit of a relationship through particular cultural practices, specifically those that involve worshipful interaction with embodied forms of divinity. Haberman goes on to suggest that the theological concept of bhava, or love, which is at the core of the bhakti tradition, is principally about relationship and embodiment. In the bhakti tradition, in the devotional love tradition, humans relate to God in an embodied manner, quote, requiring mental resolve that makes use of an individual's physical body. In short, the bhakti tradition, much like its Christian counterpart, emphasizes worship as a set of embodied practices oriented in devotional love toward God. Much of the origins of this tradition can be traced to the medieval Hindu scholar Ramanuja and his Vishishtadvaita Vedanta philosophy. Specifically for Ramanuja, quote, theoretical knowledge of God's nature would not suffice to procure liberation. Only bhakti yoga, or devotional worship of God, would be fundamentally liberative. In this light, true bhakti for Ramanuja consists of two aspects. First is embodied ritual, or the performance of duties without attachment to the results they bring. Second, bhakti consists of upasana, or constant worshipful meditation, or constant conscious awareness of God by which one achieves dhruvana smriti, or Godward orientation. In Structural Depths of Indian Thought, the Hindu scholar P.T. Raju suggests that when a believer practices both aspects of bhakti, the love of God becomes, quote, constant like the uninterrupted flow of oil, or dharavahika, end quote. For Raju, ritual and the way of action leads to contemplative meditative knowledge, the second aspect of bhakti, and this intentional and meditative knowledge perfected, made steady and constant, becomes the embodied devotional love of God. When read together, Smith's view and Ramanuja's view have profound similarities. Both emphasize the importance of embodied practices and the importance of devotional love. Nevertheless, Smith's emphasis on stories, liturgies, and experiences that shape humans, and Ramanuja's emphasis on contemplative meditation and experiential knowledge can complement one another and provide a more robust picture of worship. This framework can look as follows. Liturgies, stories, films, scriptures, images, icons, etc. consciously or unconsciously evoke an object of ultimate value that one begins to love and seek. As one is shaped by that object of ultimate value, they develop habits and practices that orient them toward that object of love. These practices invite constant awareness and meditation, or upasana, of the object of love. As a result, humans conform more and more to the image of what they worship. If what they love is good, they will conform to that goodness. If what they love is destructive, they will manifest destructiveness. Of course, before we explore this framework in light of Númenórean worship, we should note at least two notable differences between the Christian and Hindu views. First, with regard to divine embodiment in the bhakti tradition, according to Haberman, one of the, quote, crucial ingredients is intentional anthropomorphism, in which the formless is given form and familiar personality through an anthropomorphic icon. Unsurprisingly, given the aversion to making idols and statues of God in both the Christian and Númenórean traditions, it would be safe to argue that this is a point of difference. Indeed, the Númenóreans had, quote, no building and no temple, as all such things had evil associations, end quote. Second, however, the Númenórean worldview might resonate in some ways with the polytheism of certain Hindu bhakti traditions. As McBride notes, Tolkien's cosmology is best described as a, quote, monotheistic polytheism, in which the purely monotheistic Númenóreans nevertheless respected the Valar as Eru's divine and, quote, most visible representatives. For example, in his oath to Eorl, Cirion calls upon not only Eru, but also those who sit upon the thrones of the West, namely the Valar. Therefore, while they certainly did not worship the Valar, the Númenóreans revered and acknowledged the Valar as divine agents who served Eru, and even called upon them in times of trouble. Nevertheless, both the Christian and Bhakti traditions share a, quote, common orientation when it comes to the supreme goal of human life as the full and blissful knowledge and love of God, end quote. Of particular note is the pattern by which both Smith and Ramanuja articulate embodied action, knowledge, intention, and love. In short, embodied worship does not simply consist of legalistic ritual. Cultural and religious festivals, functions, and liturgies invite a certain set of actions, which invite intentional meditation and contemplation toward an object of ultimate value, which then culminates in love. We can apply this pattern to both the prayers on the Meneltarma and Sauron's deception. First, with regard to worship on the Meneltarma. Thrice a year, publicly, the Númenórean king would ascend the mountain to perform three ceremonies. Quote, a prayer for the coming year at the Erukuyerme in the first days of spring, praise of Eru Iluvatar at the Eru Laitale in midsummer, and thanksgiving to him at the Eru Hantale at the end of autumn. As we apply the framework, first one sees how the liturgy of three prayers invite Númenóreans to adopt Eru as the object of ultimate value. There is deep reverence on the mountain. Even a stranger ignorant of Númenor and its history would dare not speak aloud. End quote. Subsequently, the love of Eru leads to embodied action, manifested through the silent ascension of the mountain on foot and the king's prayer at the summit in the sight of the witnesses of Manwe. As they climb Meneltarma, the king and his retinue become mindfully aware and enter a silent meditative posture. One can see in these the two aspects of bhakti. First, the king and his retinue execute the performance of the regal duties, the way of action. Second, silent ascension invites a meditative posture, or upasana, and a steady calling to mind of God, dhruvana smriti, the way of knowledge. Finally, in turn, the love and worship of Eru shapes the hearts of the worshippers, and the worship of Eru would manifest in the flourishing of Númenor. Quote, for their fidelity, the Númenóreans grew wise and fair and glorious. Moreover, through their actions, intentions, and meditations, the faithful Númenóreans, quote, kept Ilúvatar in their hearts, end quote, even at the time of Númenor's downfall. In comparison, Sauron's deception exhibits very much the same pattern, albeit with different ends. First, Sauron offers a new liturgy and a compelling story. In Tolkien's words, Sauron, quote, turns the hearts of all the Númenóreans with the exception of the faithful towards the darkness. Sauron offers Ar-Pharazôn an, quote, orientation toward a particular vision of a good life, according to Smith. He plays on the Númenórean fear of death and yearning for immortality and tells Ar-Pharazôn that he stands to gain other worlds and that the, quote, increase of his power shall never end. Indeed, Sauron deceives Ar-Pharazôn, suggesting that the Valar have concocted Eru as a, quote, phantom devised in the folly of their hearts and that Melkor alone can deliver the Númenóreans from it. Through these deceitful stories and images, Sauron shapes what Ar-Pharazôn and the Númenóreans now love and worship. Subsequently, having established Melkor as an object of ultimate value, Sauron instructs the Númenóreans in a set of embodied practices. The first practice is the felling of the white tree, and the second is human sacrifice. As these sacrifices become regularized in the temple, the meditation and intention of the Númenóreans become increasingly violent. Indeed, Ar-Pharazôn meditates or ponders in his heart how he might make war upon the Valar, end quote. Finally, the fallen Númenóreans manifest the darkness that they love. While the meditation and worship of Eru brings flourishing, the worship of Melkor brings the Númenóreans to their ultimate destruction. For all this, death did not depart from the land. Rather, it came sooner and more often, and in many dreadful guises. Now madness and sickness assailed them, and yet they were afraid to die and go out into the dark, and they cursed themselves in their agony. Moreover, being enamored of evil knowledge eventually led the, quote, black Númenóreans to establish their dwellings in Middle-earth and worship Sauron, even after the fall of Númenor. To borrow Ramanuja's words, without abhyasa, or, quote, continuous remembrance of the presence of God with a pure body and mind, end quote, the Númenóreans can no longer hope for liberation and wholeness in action, knowledge, and love. For Tolkien, this is a perversion of worship, a, quote, darkened shadow of good, end quote, used by Sauron to establish himself as high priest in Númenor. In short, the worship of darkness consisted of more than just mere rituals. It was the wholly embodied orientation of heart and being toward the acquisition of power and the attempted conquest of Aman, which ultimately culminated in the destruction of Númenor. In conclusion, despite the notion that the peoples of Middle-earth had, quote, little or no religion in the sense of worship, end quote, or rather ritualistic worship, there is no doubt that worship plays a central role in the story of Númenor and its downfall. By placing the Númenóreans' relationship with Eru and Sauron in conversation with Christian and bhakti approaches to worship, one can see that Númenórean worship consists of more than just religious codes and rituals, but rather manifests in an embodied orientation of one's whole being toward an object of ultimate value or love. This definition of worship is of perhaps more consequence than a merely legalistic one. It reveals how liturgies and festivals and stories shape what we love. It reveals how these stories then shape our practices and actions, and how these practices subsequently affect our meditations and intentions. Finally, it shows us how worship, whether it is of Melkor or Eru, in turn shapes and forms the worshipper, either towards destruction or towards flourishing. Though the Númenóreans in the Third Age would have, quote, no petitionary prayers to God or any religion of divine worship, end quote, at least in an externally ritualistic sense, Tolkien envisioned that the, quote, worship of God would be renewed with the re-emergence of the lineal priest kings, beginning with Aragorn, who would re-enter the Hallow on Mindilluin to offer thanks and praise on behalf of the people, end quote. Though impossible to know for sure, perhaps the ultimate object of Aragorn's love, Eru, was profoundly shaped by the liturgies and stories passed down to him by faithful Númenóreans, reminding him of the folly of his ancestors. He might have recalled stories of how the elves of Aman once spoke to the Númenóreans about the promised love of Eru. That is, the promise that Ilúvatar the Father will not let those perish who love him and who love the world that he has made. However, whether or not Aragorn received these stories, one can assume that the renewed worship of Eru is not only a sign of peace and freedom, but also a sign of renewal for Númenórean influence once more. Thank you for taking the time to listen, and here is my bibliography. Thank you.
There we go. Wonderful. Thank you very much. And we do have Advait as well here joining us for our Q&A. Thank you very much for such a fascinating and different take as well. I love so far that everything that we've heard seems to be like expanding out from the, I've forgotten the word, the Anglo-centric perspective. And we're considering Tolkien's mythology from so many different angles. It's illuminating for all of us, but I know that I'm learning a lot. So thank you very much for your paper. Okay, so last time we had an online question. Jump straight into our in-person. Does anyone have a question? Super. We've got, you know what, I'm just.
Hi, thank you for a riveting paper, really. I didn't take enough notes. I wanted your thoughts about a perspective. There's a link between your paper and Irina's paper in the fact that it seems that what lies at the root of all the belief and the difference between the faithful and Ar-Pharazôn and his followers is actually those who have hope in what's going to happen, and those who have completely lost hope in Eru or in what's going to happen to them after life. And yeah. So do you agree, and how would you express it in a theological anthropological view? I really have a problem with this word in English.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me? I hope you guys can hear me. Yeah. I wish I was there. I wish I could see you in person. I definitely feel the limitations of Zoom, and just wanted to thank everyone. I love your question. So thank you so much for your question. And the reason why I love your question is because I was just reading Advait, Finrod yesterday, and it answers this very question, right? It wrestles with this very idea of Amdris, which is wishful thinking, and Estel, which is like the substantial hope. And I think what Meneltarma, the prayers on the Meneltarma were meant to do is remind people of this very substantial hope that they were to have in Eru. Right, I took a note down in in Irina's talk. She mentioned, you know, from Nature of Middle Earth, that the Fea of men were strong. I think that was the quote, that the Fea turned toward Eru in love and hope. And and in turning to love and hope, they also had, at least, you know, as kind of gosh, Finrod is talking to Andreth. He's saying, you know, I actually think there's so much hope that even after you die, even though we don't know what's going to happen to your Thea, you're going to have your Hroa, you're going to have your body. I'm so convinced of this. And, you know, Andreth is like, well, how can you have that hope? And because, you know, Finrod just has this incredible confidence in Eru. I think for me, I think that's what we see. Even though Estelle and Amdris is not really explicitly mentioned in Númenor, I think the instincts are really there. And so I think definitely what we see as, Sauron worship or Melkor worship rather, kind of increases and increases during the reign of Ar-Pharazôn, even though they're experiencing almost this new sense of prosperity. Tolkien says they're getting prosperous, but they're losing the sense of perspective. The fear of death is becoming even greater. Their sense of hope in what is substantial, their sense of orientation towards that ultimate love is now lost. And so I think there is definitely something very substantial about the loss of Estelle, the loss of hope that the Númenóreans feel that's at the very root of now their behavior and what almost becomes degenerated behavior. Hope that answers the question, but yeah, I think that was the, yeah.
A lot of nodding.
Okay, cool.
Okay, lovely, thank you. Okay, jumping on to our Zoom Q&A. So just a reminder to our online audience, if you do have a question, then please do use the Q&A function. Okay, so question from Tom. How would we contextualize Aragorn's lack of any pre-blessing prior to meals to Faramir's holding on to the tradition?
Actually, it's a very interesting note that you say that. There's this moment in Return of the King, right after they've defeated Sauron, and they're having this feast in Ithilien. And it's a very passing line. Well, I don't want to take too much time trying to find it, but it says, after the standing silence, they sat down and they went on. And yeah, there we go. There's the quote, when after the standing silence. And so I think there's this element of, there is this sense of ritual, or at least in the sense of the standing silence that's present. But I think that it's still in a very premeditative form, and I think that we'll see that evolve more as, hopefully Tolkien hopes that that becomes more formalized now in the time of Númenor. I don't know if I fully understood the question. Maybe if I missed something, well, you can let me know.
There is always also the option that because it is on Zoom, you could always pop onto the Q&A, read it yourself, and if you have something else to say, or you're like,
awesome,
oh, you know what, I did misinterpret,
yeah,
please don't worry, you can always use that opportunity.
Fantastic.
All right, so we have time for one more question. I'm going to jump back into our in-person audience. Any more questions?
I'm just wondering, the notion of standing silence and the grace before meat, in the days before the Second Vatican Council, when Mass was said, the congregation could not hear what the priest was saying at all. The whole thing was very, very, very quiet. It was ad orientem as opposed to ad occidentum. They were sort of facing towards the east rather than facing towards the west, but the congregation could not hear what was being said. That's why there was the tradition of ringing bells and things of that sort. And I'm wondering to what extent these quote unquote rituals are echoes of the pre-Vatican II Catholic Mass.
That sounds like a great observation. Unfortunately, I don't think I'm well qualified to answer that. I'm not too familiar with Vatican Mass and Catholic theologies, but I will say that I think the standing silence, at least as presented here, at least there's two instances, right? There's first this Aragorn instance, and then there's the Faramir, and both seem very intimate. It's not large masses, not large crowds. It seems like a fairly intimate setting. People knew what was happening, and so I think there's something to say about the intimacy of that, and I wonder how that would compare to these large masses or services that might kind of have happened. But yeah, I'm sorry I can't answer that question a little bit more thoughtfully. I'll have to look into it a bit more.